The Gospel of Faith, Hope and Charity according to Colum McCann. In 1994, Dermot Bolger wrote, "More than ever, it is clear that future editors will not just be turning to the banks of the Liffey, the Lee and the Lagan, but to the Thames or the Darling or the Hudson or the Loire, or even the Rhine itself, to search out the new heart of Irish writing." For a few decades indeed, Irish writers have obviously not so much been inspired by their nearby environment as by expanded horizons, particularly when they are part of the Irish diaspora. This is the case of Colum McCann, who asserts his double identity as he perceives himself as an Irish New Yorker or a man of two countries. He considers Irishness as intrinsic to his personality, but when he chose to settle in the US 25 years ago, his approach of the world differed. His first experience in America dates back to the 80s. For 2 years he traveled the States on his bicycle. He said, "It was a seminal experience. Those days still wake me up. I carry them with me. It began while I was cycling through Texas. I went through a sort of mini crisis of faith. If you've got a lot of time on a bicycle, you tend to think about God a lot. I did have a crisis of faith, and I stopped in a lot of churches. The Catholic Church, which I had grown up in, was too structured and formal for me at that stage. I wanted something new and expansive. So I'd stop in these little churches along the way, and I'd pull in on my bicycle. Also, it was a great way to get a good meal, especially in the South. On a Sunday, afterwards you'd get all that cornbread and barbecue. But I was genuinely interested in the people and the experience. I wanted to understand how they lived." Somewhat weary of the Catholic Church and its influence on Irish society, the young man wanted to meet different people and know more about their lives through the stories they told him. With the passing years, the unknown backpacker became a confirmed writer who still has a skill in listening carefully to people and makes good use of it. The stories he hears nurture his fiction. He reckons, "I've tried all my life to value the story of the anonymous other. Some people share with him the joys and hardships of their lives, their hopes, but also their doubts, their sorrows, their rage and frustration." McCann's writing has its finger on the pulse of his contemporaries. It deals with the decline of Christian belief or the challenge to the existence of God who does not command any fear or respect anymore. His texts even relate irreligious attitudes and blasphemous words. However, while many Irish writers violently settle their scores with the Catholic Church through their fiction, Colum McCann also highlights the good done by this institution, particularly in these troubled times. In 2010, when his novel Let the Great World Spin had just come out, he said, "Because of what happened with the Catholic Church and the news stories about pedophilia, I wanted to embrace the generosity, the decency that is actually embedded in the faith and in the church." Faith is a recurrent theme in McCann's mouth and written work. He admits, "A lot of my characters deal with faith in one way or another. I suppose I am obsessed by faith. I do have faith, but I disguise it in all sorts of ways." Not only the word, but also the notion of faith permeate his work, like the other theological virtues, hope and charity. There is doubtless more than meets the eye in this fiction, which shows the values of the man who has produced it. Colum McCann's work is peppered with quotations, references and allusions to the Bible, whether it is the book of Genesis or Exodus, or the books of the Old Testament or the Gospel. For example, in the opening pages of Let the Great World Spin, McCann writes regarding the funambulist who walks between the towers of the World Trade Center high above the onlookers on the streets. The man above was a word they seemed to know, though they had not heard it before. A little later, one of the characters, John Corrigan, says to his brother, "I suppose I have to put flesh on my words." Such prose is reminiscent of the first chapter of the Gospel according to John. The Word became flesh. He came to dwell among us. Much of the imagery in the novel suggests a connection between Corrigan and the funambulist. Both of them act as Christ-like figures, if not saviors. To the question, did you have the gospel in mind when creating Corrigan, McCann answers, the gospel is there, yes, but I think most of that is an emotional energy, an unacknowledged deeper emotional intelligence that I have from years gone by, having read this stuff while growing up Catholic. So it was not entirely conscious at the time. I was not thinking, this is the gospel, this is John's gospel, but you're hoping that embedded in there are all these little shards of learning that you have. Everywhere we have been is everywhere we are now. We gather, we throw off small shards of history and meaning. The gospel is part of the writer's heritage and influences him. Whether genuine, apparent, forgotten, or ignored, these influences are connected to his cultural milieu, education, environment, experiences, and readings. In an interview, McCann said he was also inspired by reality. He based Corrigan on a man of faith he met in the Bronx in New York. I got a letter many years ago from the Jesuit priest Daniel Berrigan. It was about this side of brightness. The most extraordinary and generous letter. And I got to know him and read his poems, and I fell in love with the ideas of Berrigan, his ideas on liberation theology, his activism, his radical Christ. I find him extraordinary. And when I first started writing this novel, Let the Great World Spin, I called my character Berrigan. Of course, it's not him, so I had to change the name. Corrigan came close. Called the Holy Outlaw, Father Daniel Berrigan never came to terms with the conservatism of the Catholic Church. He lived his life as a militant servant of the Christian faith. He developed a reputation as a religious radical, working actively against poverty. He and his brother Philip, who was also a priest, founded the Catholic Peace Fellowship, a group that organized protests against the war in Vietnam and even destroyed draft files in Maryland in 1968. They were arrested, imprisoned, and issued a statement after the incident. We confront the Roman Catholic Church, other Christian bodies, and the synagogues of America with their silence and cowardice in the face of our country's crimes. We are convinced that the religious bureaucracy in this country is racist, is an accomplice in this war, and is hostile to the poor. Throughout his life, Berrigan maintained his opposition to American interventions abroad, from Central America in the 1980s through the Gulf War in 1991, the US invasion of Afghanistan, and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In addition, much of his later work was devoted to assisting AIDS patients in New York City. He said of pastoral care to these patients, "We deal with very many gay Catholics who have felt terribly hurt and misused by the Church. There are some people who want to be reconciled with the Church, and there are others who have great bitterness. So I try to perform whatever human or religious work that seems called for." McCann admired this man for his courageous stance, his militancy, and his work with the outcast and despised, for whom he was ready to go to jail and even give his life. When McCann says about himself, "I'm not a religious man, not in a formal sense anyway," he means that he's unlikely to be seen on his knees praying in a church. Nevertheless, is always ready to exhibit a nod towards social conscience, engage in public debate, and act for more truth and justice. The words he uses to describe Father Berrigan prove that he considers him as a model and follows in his footsteps. Both of them socialize with men and women on the fringes of society and listen to them sympathetically. Such exchanges sow the seeds of McCann's fiction and incite him to fight against the absolute of despair, as he puts it. Another man admired by McCann, this time in the political sphere, is Barack Obama, not only because he thinks he's a decent and honest man, but also and mostly because he gave hope to so many Americans. In his interviews, McCann readily quotes a phrase Obama used in a speech which thrust him to the foreground of the political scene: the audacity of hope. In the Democratic Convention in Boston in July 2004, Obama said indeed, "Do we participate in the politics of hope? I'm not talking about blind optimism here. No, I'm talking about something more substantial. It's the hope of slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs, the hope of immigrants setting out for distant shores, the hope of a young naval lieutenant bravely patrolling the Mekong Delta, the hope of a mill worker's son who dares to defy the odds, the hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too, hope in the face of difficulty, hope in the face of uncertainty, the audacity of hope." These words were taken up in the title of his book, which developed the program of his presidential campaign, The Audacity of Hope: Thoughts on Reclaiming the American Dream. The people held up as examples in this speech could become characters in McCann's fiction. Even in the lives of his objective protagonists, there is the desire for a better life, the prospect of hope and redemption. Redemption is one of the key words that structure McCann's entire literary project. This is why Owen Flannery's study approaches the work from this angle. In the introduction of his book, Colum McCann and the Aesthetics of Redemption, Flannery writes, "McCann's narratives are not programmatic assertions of alternative political worlds, but human desire for change, the imagination of redemption, the anticipation of a better life, and the prospects of solidarity being forged with previously othered communities are all tangible, utopian foci of his fictions. Out of the negativity or alienation and suffering detailed in McCann's narratives, there are consistent and durable moments of hope and recovery. In Blockian fashion, hope emerges out of despair. The positive is present in the negative." McCann's characters are often wounded, emotionally broken by drug addiction, injustice, discrimination, poverty, the absence of loved ones, and other misfortunes. Loss and loneliness define them, but regardless of the degree of their despair, so does hope. McCann witnessed this inextinguishable hope among the homeless in the New York City subway tunnels while conducting research for This Side of Brightness. He said, "No matter who they were across all spectrums, race, gender, economics, every single one of them said, 'When I get out of here.' Not if I get out of here, when I get out of here. There is that deep place, no matter how dark the darkness, there is a part of us as humans that says, we will eventually get to some sort of light. That's what keeps you going." McCann's exiles have a rage to live. In order to give a more practical significance to this notion of hope, the writer took part in a group of authors who gathered in Colorado in summer 2013 to wonder about the relationship between literature and social work. This meeting gave birth to an association co-founded by himself. Narrative 4 is a global network of artists, educators and students that uses the power of personal stories to spark collaborative change and foster empathy across borders. Narrative 4 gives people all over the world the ability to share their stories in a new and powerful way. Those who may otherwise be voiceless are identified and brought to a safe space to tell a significant story from their lives. They are then given the chance to own and articulate someone else's story, to craft it and carry it with them back to their communities. These story exchanges build a mutual trust that strips away the typical narratives of cynicism and despair, allowing new ones to take shape. There can be a narrative for immigration, a narrative for the environment, for religion, for peace, and on, hence Narrative 4. This is how young people from Israel and Palestine have been able to talk and listen to one another, a theme that is prolonged and developed in his latest novel, Aperogon. Narrative 4 is not only a concept of empathy into action, but it also favors conciliation and reconciliation. Some theologians and philosophers consider that many of our contemporaries nowadays do not know any longer what believing, hoping, and loving mean. While keeping out of any dogmatic discourse, a fiction like Colum McCann's can shed a new light on these words. There are three things that last forever: faith, hope, and charity, but the greatest of them all, according to Paul, is charity. And this virtue is also very present in McCann's work, even if it would be more accurate to speak about altruism or benevolence. McCann's international travels made a new man of him and shaped his approach of the human being. His fiction mirrors his personal point of view. It pays particular attention to the other, the outcast, and the dispossessed. His novel This Side of Brightness is focused on the Irish immigrants in New York. These men build skyscrapers, dig the tunnels of the metropolitan network when they are not purely and simply homeless. All of them are somehow kept away from the prosperous city. As I said before, completing his research for his novel, McCann spent many months among the homeless, beneath the subway systems, in order to describe their living conditions faithfully. For another novel, Zoli, a fictionalization of the life of the Romani poet Pepusha, his research took him to Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Slovakia, where he stayed among the Roma. McCann does not hesitate to go and meet the ones who live on the fringes of society. Such initiatives are in keeping with the call of Pope Francis to go to the peripheries and not to remain stuck looking at oneself. The Pope incites Catholics to go to the peripheries, not only geographical peripheries but also existential peripheries, those of pain, injustice, those of all misery. Just like Jesus Christ, who has always been in close touch with marginal groups, Colum McCann has a preference for the poor and little ones, without being patronizing or condescending, without passing judgment on them. There is no preaching in these contacts, no incitement to conversion. It is just a matter of meeting, reciprocity, and friendship. I'm not a holy roller, that's for sure, he says. At the best of times, I'd call myself a collapsed Catholic. I suppose I have a Christ obsession, but that's me and 3 billion others. If there's any person to be, then be Christ. Be poor, be decent, be haunted, be angry, be understanding. Of course, we all fail at even the most simple of these things. I think we could do with a dose of Christ now. He is, in the end, far more interesting than our navels. The way the other is perceived by Colum McCann excludes any kind of organization, into a hierarchy. The other is not inferior to me. He or she is my equal, my fellow creature, my neighbor. And who is my neighbor? Asks a character of the Gospel to Jesus, who replies with the parable of the Good Samaritan. This story values solidarity and sympathy with the other who stands outside the circle of my acquaintances, beyond religious or national proximity. My neighbor is the one who can be very different from me. This story from the Gospel is not moralizing. It merely states a fact. The servant of God can have a heart of stone. The man who fell into the hands of the robbers and was left half dead by the roadside is not looked after by the priest or the Levite, but by a heretical outsider. The Samaritan is neighbor to him because he considers he is human like himself. He considers both of them are on an equal footing. From now on, the neighbor is no longer a category, but a dynamic process of approaching others in their griefs, in their doubts, in their anxieties about the future. Approaching them to let them know that there is still life for them, that they are not doomed to death. The wounded man recovers his dignity. He is brought back to the community of the living. The Samaritan is kind enough to restore his faith and hope. Ironically, Jesus incites his listeners to imitate the one who showed kindness to his neighbor. As a matter of fact, the model is a heathen, which means that all of us are invited to break down our barriers. Is it not what Colum McCann does, breaking down barriers, when he makes contact with the victims of social exclusion, when he rehabilitates them by making them the central characters of his books? Indeed, while society considers dropouts on a lower rank on the social ladder, McCann makes them the protagonists of his plot. His fiction does the exact opposite of what society does. By focusing on a socially peripheral character, it rehabilitates dropouts and highlights them. Conversely, citizens who hold important positions in society become second-class citizens in fiction and remain in the background. The center in reality becomes the periphery in fiction, and vice versa. McCann's work can be read as a parable. It disconcerts, questions, gives food for thought, invites the reader to search what can be drawn from it. It also gives faith and hope, and betrays that the writer cares about other people. Did he not act like a good Samaritan when he tried to help a woman who had been assaulted along a busy street? McCann was attacked from behind, knocked unconscious, and hospitalized. He suffered multiple injuries, had severe contusions over both eyes. His cheekbone was fractured, and several teeth were broken. He showed the photo of his messed up face on his website. If need be, this incident, which took place in New Haven, Connecticut, on the 27th of June 2014, shows the man's human qualities which are mirrored in his books. In Let the Great World Spin, we can read, when he was 16, Corrigan had written in the inside of a cigarette packet that all the proper gospel of the world could be written in the inside of a cigarette packet. It was that simple. You could do unto others what you'd have them do unto you. And indeed, the Golden Rule summarizes the whole law. It represents the best of human justice, and Colum McCann is aware that putting this rule into practice, treating others as you want to be treated, makes life worth living. His state of mind, his commitments, his literary work show that he has faith in human beings, in their capacities to resist and get back to their feet. He's close to them, particularly if they are suffering, and strives to give them hope. He has great sympathy for the victims of contempt, and as a writer invites his readers to attention kindness, and action. Because he knows that literature can be a force for change, his ambition is trying to better the world through his fiction. He says, we have to create the world this way so that the meek might actually want to dwell in it. Writing on them empathetically, McCann proves that he is anxious to maintain the tradition of the social novel, which makes it possible to put his literary work on the ground, in the muck and the mire, and to restore the possibility of decency for the ordinary man and woman. Refusing fatality, he strives to stand by the feeble and the oppressed. He does not write about them from abstract mind visions, he writes with them, as he lived among them. His fiction is thus given the value of testimony. For McCann, homelessness, as any kind of marginalization, should be questioned by affluent citizens and incite them to think about and act for the establishment of a society that could be fair for all. Thank you very much.